Hi, welcome to the Also Called podcast, where we're asking hard questions about our place in this hectic world.
Join us as we dig into the truth about who God is, possibly discovering that we are also called. Welcome to the Also Called podcast. In today's episode, we'll meet the woman from our recently released book, The Other Disciples. Today, we're diving into the life-changing story of the woman at the well, or Photini, the 11th disciple from the book. Join us as we discover who she was, her remarkable meeting with Jesus, and the insight and freedom she received from a traveling prophet who told her everything she ever did. We'll explore the lessons from her life, ministry, and deep love for Jesus, and consider what they offer us today. So get ready for the journey into the heart of a faithful follower, and let's get started. I'm Mia, and I'm learning He meets me where I am and loves me for who I am, regardless.
I'm Andrea, and I'm learning to let go of judgments of myself and of others.
So today we have Andrea Buffkin with us, and she is the writer of The Woman at the Well, chapter 11. And Andrea followed her dream of climbing northward from her hometown of Columbia, Mississippi to the mountains of North Carolina. She counts herself blessed to experience the beauty of the Blue Ridge Mountains with her husband most of the time, and the trek along the trails with her dog Lucy. Andrea is a massage therapist, which is only gainful employment, but not necessarily her calling. She has had the privilege of participating in ministries that support the families of individuals in addiction recovery and is currently exploring trauma-informed massage therapy. She enjoys bargain shopping, engaging in healthy debates, and finding a great new book to add to her pile on her nightstand. Her legacy is 5 amazing kids who keep her on the move. She's also a board member of Bible and Pop Culture and a regular contributor to the magazine. So welcome, Andrea.
Thank you. Okay, so Photini, it wasn't until I started doing the research for this that I knew she had a name. She is not named in scripture, but you can find her story in John chapter 4, verses 1 through 42. But most of the time, if you've heard of her, it's the woman at the well or the Samaritan woman. What we learn from her passage is she is a woman who her life does not look like the normal woman of her time, and it probably doesn't look like what she anticipated it was going to look like. And just based on the little bit, or well, actually, I feel incredibly fortunate that I had so much to work with. We get to learn a lot from her through this section, but we see that she probably felt isolated. Her story starts where she's going to the well, and notably in scripture, it states the time that she comes. And normally, when I'm just reading through a passage, I would just be like, oh, and disregard that. But it's actually important. The time that she was going, she was probably doing that to avoid being around other people. And lo and behold, there's this guy there, and she has an interaction with him. And through that interaction, it doesn't go like the other stories that we see in the Bible of interactions and meetings at the well. And again, this is something I didn't realize until I really started doing some research for this book, but most of the other stories were wedding stories. They were introductions where a bride was found. And so this woman meets Jesus. And if you are familiar with the pattern in the stories of the Bible, you may think, oh, this is going to be nice. And it doesn't go quite as planned. She had a little bit of sass. So it was a lot of fun to get to know her, imagine what her life looked like in comparison to what it should have.
I love that you picked up on her sass. That's great. That's my favorite part about her. So what drew you to being a part of the Other Disciples project?
Oh, goodness. Well, being a part of anything that you ask me to be a part of is always going to be exciting. I really do admire you and your faithfulness and the way you connect with, the biblical stories and how they apply to our lives today. And having these conversations with you so that we can learn from the struggles that these women had, see how here we are 2,000 years later, and we're still having some of the same conversations and the same struggles. So I didn't know at first how I was actually even going to be a part of this. I was just happy to be involved. then here we are. Yeah, it's just it's really exciting to see the connection in those stories and how we can see ourselves in them today.
Well, I'm so glad you did. And I knew you had no idea what you were getting into, but we would figure it out along the way. So I know writing's not your favorite thing in the world, so thank you for doing it. So what drew you to writing about Fatini?
Oh gosh, well, I guess what resonated with me in her story is that it looks like how she's identified in the passage. She's identified by her circumstances. And that really resonated with me because, when I grew up in church, my parents are phenomenal and I'll always have stories about them and the beautiful things that I learned from them. But being raised in the Deep South in a Southern Baptist church for the most part, you get these messages about what life is supposed to look like. And some of it's in a negative way, and some of it is just expectations, in a positive way. Like I saw this beautiful relationship between my parents, and so I wanted the husband and the 2.5 kids and the dog and the white picket fence, but it was not necessarily because that's what I was taught that that's what I was supposed to do. Although, society does have that picture of what, a woman is supposed to grow up and want to be. But I saw a great relationship modeled for me, and I wanted that partnership as well. So, anyway, life didn't turn out that way for me at all. And so, when you have this expectation of what life is supposed to be, and it doesn't look like that, you get to the point where, okay, so now what? So that's what really drew me to her specifically is it looks like she was identified by her circumstances. And I certainly felt like that many, many times throughout my life.
I relate to her story too. What did you enjoy most about the writing process, if any?
Yeah, the writing that was not fun. I'm sorry. The deadlines were not fun. So, I'm more of a verbal processor, apparently, is what I've discovered. So it was great to be able to talk through some of the things. But the writing, I would just say the process of the months leading up to and while we were writing more communication with, and this isn't necessarily about the scripture passage, but just about the process that we went through. It was at a very difficult time in my life. I had kind of lost my church family. I was separated from my husband and been married for 13 years. So I had my own personal kind of struggles that I was going through, and I was really focused on my own mental health. And it's so cliche to be in your mid 40s and be like, it's my healing journey. That's that's what it was. And writing became part of that process. But part of that process was also community with the other women who were part of this project. So it was beautiful to be able to get to know some of these women and get their ideas, and also simply just being in the Word, diving in and trying to learn something more from it than the random sermons that we've heard throughout the years if you've been part of a church about the Samaritan woman and her sinful nature and how she was redeemed and all that. So it was really good to be able to get in there and learn from a different perspective on her story.
Yeah, I thought you did a phenomenal job. I can't wait to jump in.
So the fictional story at the beginning, I had hard enough time just writing in general. So when it came to writing the fictional piece, I knew that was beyond my capabilities. So Mia, can you contributed the fictional story to my chapter? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Interestingly, the year before, I had written a piece for a Resurrection Sunday sketch series for a sermon series. So when you and I started talking through, I was like, "Hey, I got something already done. Let's revisit that." The two of us kind of sat down and looked through it, and I love that you and I were already in cahoots as far as her sass. What would she look like as a modern woman? I was cracking up when I was writing it because I live in Florida and Highway 98 is like the big road in our area. And so I was sitting there thinking about some of the bars that are on Highway 98. And so just put her at a place called the Watering Hole off of 98. And just imagine like meeting her at a bar. What would she have to say and how excited would she be? And so really trying to capture her sass and her excitement and her enthusiasm and her newfound hope, newfound freedom, newfound coming into like instead of letting her past define her and hold her back, her enthusiasm of like, God's going to use this and never looking back from that. And so that was the fun part of writing about her. Where would Jesus have met her and what would her reaction to that be? So it was a fun piece to write and it came really quickly. So thank God. Okay, so what do you want to cover about Fotini's cultural or historical context to kind of give some context to our readers or listeners who haven't read the book at this point?
Well, so one of the books that I read in preparation for this, trying to get a different perspective, was The Samaritan Woman's Story, Reconsidering John 4 after hashtag Church 2. And Caryn A. Reeder is the author of that book. I'm not a researcher, but she is. And she has a lot of references to legal documents from that time period, which we don't get a lot of stories from a female perspective from that time simply because of the culture and men were recording it. So it's going to be from a male's perspective. Coming across historical documents, legal documents, gives us more of a window of what it was like for a woman from a legal standpoint, especially when we start talking about the marriages during this time. Just like with today, there are laws that may have an intention, but that's not always how things work out. You know, people are going to abuse power and authority, and there are loopholes and things like that. I guess just one thing I would like to point out with the cultural and historical part with her and the marriages, the way it's presented to us most of the time is because she had five marriages. She's obviously a sinful, promiscuous woman. And so I would just like to say that women were often married the first time. Their first marriage was often between 12 and 15, and men were older usually. So, because of that age difference, it would not be uncommon for a woman to have multiple marriages. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that men could divorce their wives for anything. If they didn't, if the infertility was an issue, or they just found someone more attractive and wanted to trade in and upgrade, they could do that. So, that's another thing to point out. But also, she was a Samaritan, and there were major issues between Samaritans and the Jewish people. Mia, you would probably do a much better job with the actual historical stuff because I'm more of a theme, big theme, overall kind of thing. I don't really hang on to the details, but at some point, there politically and religiously, there was a separation. I think that's another thing that really truly applies to our society today. Most of the time, we tend to focus on the things that separate us, especially when we have a shared history. But we tend, when there is deviation, it seems like we have a tendency to focus on the differences rather than the shared past.
Yes, exactly. And that's exactly what was happening is when the two kingdoms separated, and then especially once the Samaritan kingdom created their own place of worship. They weren't going to the temple in Jerusalem anymore. I believe it's in Mount Gerizim. That's when it just, the Davidic tribe was like, nope, nope, we don't even recognize you anymore. And then like you said, they just started focusing on all the differences as opposed to, hey, we're all Hebrews. So I think that's great. One thing I wanted to clarify, and something you just said about the woman having marriages, she might have had multiple marriages because of death of her husband or been divorced. It wasn't like she made up her mind that she wanted a divorce and she wanted to remarry. That wasn't her prerogative. That was, like you said, in the divorce, it was his. So women might have been married multiple times, but it almost never was by her choice. So I just wanted to clarify that. Again, supporting what you and Carolyn Reeder said, that, it wasn't her that pursued the divorce all 5 times. So anyway, awesome. What do you want to cover about her issue?
There were many. What we see from scripture is not only the 5 marriages, but she was also living with someone that was not her husband. And so this is another thing that I would like to point out too. There are different reasons why people, just like today, would have been living with someone without a legal marriage. She could have just been living in the house and caring for an elderly man. They could just be combining resources. He may have been a Roman soldier and they weren't able to get married from the things that I've read. There are a multitude of reasons why she could have been living with someone, but there were also with the Jewish culture when there were marriage contracts beforehand. So once they entered into contract, even if they were considered married, even if they weren't actually living in the same home, or consummated the marriage or whatever, they were considered married. So that's one of the issues, her multiple marriages, and she's living with someone for whatever reason who isn't her legal husband at this point. But I really think overall, based on how she interacts with Jesus, it seems like she has her defenses up. It seems like her life did not go as according to plan. And there have been a lot of judgments against her in her time and continues to be today when her story is shared. There have been a lot of judgments against her. And I think that she probably began to believe some of those truths and not necessarily believe in agreement with them, but you kind of get to the point, and again, maybe I'm bringing too much of my own story and feelings into this and how I perceive it, but sometimes you get to a point where you don't agree with what others are saying and you don't agree with that belief, but you do accept that this is their perception of you. This is what they think of you from what they're able to see. So I think that was probably at the heart of it. Her life didn't look like it what she thought it was going to or what other people thought it should be. And she just began to build walls so that she could no longer be hurt by, the standards of the day that it looks like she failed and she missed the mark. And I think she probably just had a lot of barriers. And I think that's shown by how she responded to Jesus when he started talking to her. I mean, in essence, she's like, bro, why are you talking to me?
Exactly. I love what you said in the book on pages 179 and 180. You say she's often labeled as a homewrecker, if not a prostitute, and the sexual objectification of the Samaritan woman and the corresponding minimization of her contribution to the narrative has consequences for women in the church. It authorizes, and you're quoting from Carolyn Reeder. You said it authorizes to reduce sexualization of women and encourages the identification of women as dangers to men's salvation. And I think the other thing that you say later in 184 and 85 is exactly what you're talking about. If you've ever experienced disappointment or broken trust, you can imagine that if it happens repeatedly, you start to develop your own bias and years of self-judgment and judgment from those around you. Sees how she starts wearing those wounds as armor. And I think that's exactly it, is her trust has been broken at least 5 times, if not longer. We don't even know about the trauma that contributed to all of her issues. But I love that. And can you talk a little bit about how broken trust contributes to broken relationships and judgment?
I guess it depends on the relationship. I opened my chapter sharing that one of the first times I remember being treated differently was by my own church family. It was a church where I had grown up, basically. I found myself pregnant before I got married. And I was actually engaged at the time, but I still wasn't married yet. Then I called off the wedding because, I'm a rebel. Uh, but I called off the wedding and I remember like this is gonna sound so silly, but my church, they didn't host a baby shower for me. That broke my heart. And it was the first time, I guess, that I really realized and internalized that the relationship that you have with someone, what you think it is doesn't always matter. You can't always depend on it. That if you don't meet the expectation, you get treated differently.
And I think that's the biggest challenge, is that you have your cultural expectations, sometimes you have a religious institution's expectation, then you have the biblical expectation, and it's like, yeah, they're challenging to meet, and sometimes there's reasons that we don't. So let's go into then at the heart of it. What was her problem?
Being judged by others and feeling less than.
You talk about that. You said, have you ever felt like you don't fit in with the very system you were trained to be part of? Do you ever get exhausted from trying to explain your position or justify your worth? And then talk to us a little bit about she meets Jesus. What's set it up, and then what happens?
Okay, so she's out running errands. And I mentioned this before, but the scripture tells us that it's at noon. And so historically, that is not the normal time that women would be going to gather water for the day. It would either be happening first thing in the morning or it would be in the evening cooler. And it was also a social time. Women would go together, and this is when they could talk and socialize. So it's important that she was going at 12. So I don't know if you've ever been out running errands and you did something because and you choose an inconvenient time because you want to run into the least amount of people. I feel like that's what she was doing. And so as she's walking up to the well, she sees this guy hanging out. And in her mind, I'm sure she's just like, what in the world? Why is he here? And then she proceeds to go on about her business and he asks her for water. He asks her for something, and her response is, you're a Jew, I'm Samaritan, why are you talking to me? In essence, that's that's what it is. So they have this dialogue, which this is another thing that I learned. This is the longest documented conversation that Jesus has with anyone in scripture. And not only is it the longest conversation, but it's an actual conversation. Most of the time, these conversations that are documented in scripture, Jesus kind of turns it into a sermon, not in a bad way, but it's a teachable moment. And so there's very little input from the person he's having a conversation with. So I just love this passage because she seems to be very confrontational and argumentative. So it's kind of like, why are you talking to me? And so then he offers something about water and every time he offers her something, she is kind of deflecting. I feel like she's being argumentative and deflecting and trying to get him to talk about something else. And then at one point, she says she's kind of like, oh, well, we'll wait for the Messiah. We'll let him determine that. Because she challenged him on, well, where should we be worshiping? Again, she wanted to point out the difference in the Samaritans and the Jews. And she asked him, well, where should we be worshiping? So, she just kind of, well, we'll just wait on the Messiah. And then Jesus reveals himself to her. That changed everything. Not only did she meet Jesus and he reveal himself to her, but I believe the heart posture was already working just throughout the conversation, the interaction with him, because he was being patient and having a conversation with her and demonstrating you're worth having this conversation with.
And that's huge. I mean, to me, my background in education is in communications, and to see a give and a take. He's asking questions, which means he sees her, he hears her, he genuinely wants to know her. And that, so many times in our culture today, people talk at us or we talk at people. It is not an exchange. So I love that you caught that. That's gorgeous. And then the second part is that he values her dialogue. He sees she is an intelligent woman. She is not just the stereotype that we have in our heads about these first century women who were just baby makers and homemakers. She thought about things. She had theological opinions. She knew her stuff. So I love that you caught that, and it just speaks about Jesus, that he knows each person and he knows what's going to grab her heart and is going to grab her attention so that he can do something about her situation. So I love that. What else did you see that Jesus did or in their interaction that gives us a little more about who he is or what he wanted to do specifically for her situation?
He sees her and in her value and her intelligence and all of those things, that you just pointed out. He also recognizes to her, he verbalizes to her, I know you've been married 5 times, and I know the guy you're living with now isn't your husband. So I think it's very important that Jesus stated it very clearly so that she understood not only does he value this interaction and find me worthy of a conversation, but he knows more than that. It's like supernaturally, he knows more than that. So maybe he is the Messiah, but it allows her to know he sees all of me, not just the parts that are visible or that I'm presenting. He sees all of me, all the things that I am shameful of, all the things that I wish I had done differently, all the things that I feel like I don't measure up, all the things that I've been judged for and judge myself over. He sees all of that, and he still entered into this conversation with me.
And I love that he does not shy away from the truth. Currently, the at least Western Christian model of Jesus is sweet and gentle like a lamb, and he is the Lion of Judah. But I think the other part of it is I love what our church in Washington, when we lived in Washington State, talked about is there's a pillar of grace and a pillar of truth, and Jesus knows how to walk exactly in the middle because if it's grace, 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 and you don't confront the truth of something, it's called greasy grace. So it doesn't really change a life. But if you err on the side of truth and you just tell the truth, it's harsh and it's hurtful and it comes across as judgmental. And Jesus walks that fine line right in the middle. He's like, I see you for who you are. I see the value that you bring to the conversation and eventually what he'll call her into. But he also says, let's talk about the truth of this situation so I can set you free from it. It gives me hope because so many times I don't want Jesus to touch my stuff because it's going to hurt. I don't want to hurt. But she just bravely says, all right, let's do this. And she's different because of it.
Thank you so much for joining us today. Also Called provides a space for honest conversations about the truth of who God is, who we are, and the relationships He wants us to have with Him, each other, the church, and ourselves. This episode was just the start of the conversation. Be sure to check the show notes for extra resources to go further. You can also find our social media sites to join the discussion. Don't miss our next chat by subscribing to our YouTube channel or wherever you listen to podcasts.
Also Called is part of Bible and Pop Culture, a crowd-funded nonprofit that allows us to provide our content to start great conversations for free. You can help us keep doing this by checking out BibleandPopCulture.com or AlsoCalled.org's Donate Subscribe buttons with a one-time gift, supporting us monthly, or sharing us with someone who might like the conversation. Thank you for being a part, and see you next conversation.